Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Anthropology section of the New York Academy of Sciences. My name is Uzma Rizvi, and I am an associate professor of anthropology and urban studies at Pratt Institute. In my role as chair of the board of the Anthropology section, New York Academy of Sciences, I wanted to thank all of you for joining us from the various places and times you may be from. This evening in New York City, we are excited to present as a part of our 2020-2021 programming on reimagining resilience and our distinguished lecture series, a talk by Professor Michael Blakey entitled African Diasporic Activist Scholarship, Beyond the Enlightenment Towards Democratization of Science. This will be followed by a conversation with Peggy King Jorde and Rachel Watkins. Now, as a part of our original convening, we had also invited Professor Leith Mullings, who is certainly ever present with us, even in her absence. Her passing has left an indelible mark on anthropology. We have certainly lost one of our greats. To honor her, her memory, and spirit, please join me in a moment of silence. My heart holds a lot of gratitude for the work and brilliance that Professor Mullings brought to the world. At the dedication ceremony in 2007 at the African Burial Ground, poet laureate Maya Angelou said some words that have never really left me, and they kind of echo whenever I think about Professor Mullings as well. Today it's African Americans because the playing field has not been evened, but it could have been Asian Americans, it could have been a cemetery for Jewish Americans, or Muslim Islamic Americans. It could have been a Native American cemetery. It is imperative that each of us knows that we own this country because we've already been paid for. It's imperative. It's this imperative that continued to echo in my mind many years later. I think of our talk today as part of that imperative. In fact, whether I consider Michael Blakey's 1987 co-authored piece with Cheryl LaRoche in Historical Archaeology entitled On Seizing Intellectual Power, the Dialogue at the New York African Burial Ground, or his more recent work, like his 2020 piece, Archaeology Under the Blinding Light of Race and Current Anthropology. I think of his work as responding to an imperative that white supremacy is insistent on erasing. I have, throughout my own career, looked to the work done by Professor Blakey, learning the ways, the practice of what it means to be, to work with and within and for and in the service of communities of research. And so I wanted to start by acknowledging how indebted so many of us are to the work of such stalwarts. And that is why it is such an honor for me to be introducing this evening's programming. Of course, in order to ensure that all of this programming can happen, we rely on grants and sponsors. And so I'd also like to acknowledge the Wenner Grant Foundation for Anthropological Research and Bergen Books for supporting the anthropology section. Equally significant, if not more constant, is the board of advisors for our section. I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the many hours of work done by our board on these events. I particularly wanted to thank board member and vice chair Matt Riley and our treasurer Ryan Rome, as well as our anthropology section fellows Anna Sergeyeva and Miriam Leitner. Without all of them, none of this would be possible. I'd now like to invite Professor Blakey to turn on his camera, and it's my great honor to introduce him. Michael Blakey is a National Endowment for the Humanities professor of Anthropology, Africana Studies, and American Studies, and founding director of the Institute for Historical Biology at the College of William and Mary. Dr. Blakey was a key advisor of the award-winning Race, Are We So Different exhibition of the American Anthropological Association, where he held several offices, including president of the Association of Black Anthropologists between 1987 and 1989, a member of the editorial board of American Anthropologists between 2012 and 2016. Blakey represented the United States on the Council of the Fourth World Archaeological Congress in Cape Town, South Africa. This was in 1999. He's a member of the Scholarly Advisory Committee of the National Museum of African American History and Culture of the Smithsonian Institution, where he previously held the position of Research Associate in Physical Anthropology at the National Museum of Natural History. This was between 1985 and 94. He was scientific director of the New York African Burial Ground Project 1992 to 2009, the most extensive bioarchaeological project in the United States. The Manhattan site became a US National Monument in 2007. Blakey has held professorships at Spelman College, Columbia, Brown, Spezia, and Howard University, where he founded the W. Montague Cobb Biological Anthropology Laboratory. He was director or co-director of the Remembering Slavery, Resistance, and Freedom Project, sponsored by the Virginia General Assembly from 2010 to 2015. His most recent book, in 2009, is The Skeletal Biology of the New York African Burial Ground with Leslie Rankin Hill. His recent articles in English and French cover bioarchaeology, public engaged archaeology, and scientific racism. He's currently working on a monograph on race and racism in science and society, and I am so looking forward to the book. His numerous awards include Honorary Doctors of Science, York College CUNY. He earned the BA at Howard University, his MA and PhD in anthropology from University of Massachusetts Amherst, and completed courses at Oxford and London universities. Michael, we're so thrilled to host you this evening. And for those of you in the audience, you should know that we'll be live tweeting during the event. So we're at NYAS_anth. And so if you're so inclined, please do join the conversation there. To become part of our growing community, you can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram at NYAS_anth, like us on Facebook, you know, the whole shebang, right? And join our email listserv and become part of our vibrant community of anthropologists. Finally, throughout the course of the webinar, all audience members can post questions in the question and answer section on the lower bar of your Zoom menu, or if you are watching us on YouTube, in the comments section. We will be collecting the questions throughout the program and hope we can get to as many of them as possible through the course of the panel. In case of a breach of security, we do have a secondary Zoom ready, and it'll take about 10 minutes for a relaunch. So please check your emails for the link. We don't expect anything to happen, but it's always good to be prepared. With that, please join me in welcoming Professor Michael Blakey. Michael.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Rizvi. It's an honor to be here, and I wish everyone a good evening. I have a lot of slides this evening, which means that this may be a bit inelegant, because it's, for me, I think, celebratory, the 30th anniversary of the African Burial Ground. So I want you to see all the people I could squeeze in who were so important to that effort, for whom I have some decent slides. And the theme is about, the theme, of course, is broader than the African Burial Ground. It has to do with African diasporic scholars and that intellectual tradition that tends towards towards activism, towards solving problems, towards the uplift of the people. And it may begin actually with Olaudah Equiano at the end of the 18th century, who writes the first accurate ethnography of Africa and the Atlantic world. And he does it not just for the sake of increasing knowledge, he does it to end slavery. That's the essence of activist scholarship. The second person who comes to mind is very close to my heart, because his work, Claims of the Negro Ethnologically Considered, I believe should be certainly in the American anthropological canon. It is, like Equiano, what was recently referred to by anthropologist Savannah Shange as abolitionist ethnography. So she recommending that we do it. As I look back, I think we always have, even before anthropology was established as a formal discipline. But person I'm referring to is Frederick Douglass. And he begins with a critique, really, of a basic Enlightenment principle that I will dig into with you. He says, the relation subsisting between the white and Black people of this country. Let me share my screen. Oh, already. There we are. The relation subsisting between the white and Black people of this country is the vital question of the age. And of course, he's speaking during slavery. He says, in the solution of this question, the scholars of America will have to take an important and controlling part. This is the moral battlefield to which their country and their God now call them. In the eye of both, the neutral scholar is an ignoble man. Here a man must be hot or be accounted cold, or perchance something worse than hot or cold. The lukewarm and the cowardly will be rejected by earnest men on either side of the controversy. The cunning man who avoids it to gain favor of both parties will be rewarded with scorn, and the timid man who shrinks from it for fear of offending either party will be despised. The lawyer, the preacher, the politician, and the man of letters, to the man of letters, there is no neutral ground. He who is not for us is against us. Here he says, I may speak with freedom the thought nearest my heart.
Michael, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but your slides didn't go through.
I see. There's no slide. I have a slide in front of me.
So you go to share screen.
Okay, let me get out. Share screen, all right. Can you see this?
Yes, and
Okay.
now you'll have to, if you'd like to go from the beginning or from wherever you'd like.
Okay, thank you. Funny, all right, from the beginning. All right, can you see it now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. Activism, by Webster's definition, is direct, vigorous action in support or opposition to one side of a controversial issue. This conforms neatly to Frederick Douglass's admonition at the beginning of scholarly activism. He says, you are either for us or against us. While one might argue that taking any side of such issues constitutes activism, I believe the history of activist scholarship bears out a pattern definition of it. It is the side which speaks truth to power, that seeks societal change, that pursues equity among any and all people, that does the right thing. He also recognized the impediment of the fatuous claim of neutrality in the American anthropology at its birth, which was 1854 in the publication of Notting Gliddon's compendium of Samuel Morton's work called Types of Mankind. Alois Lischka, founding physical anthropology some decades later, points back to Morton as the first American anthropologist, and I think he's about right. So it is in that year that Douglass responds with his critique of objectivity, of neutrality, as well as with a critique of biological determinism. When I was a graduate student at UMass nearly 40 years ago, I remember attending a prose seminar at Amherst College led by anthropologist Marshall Solins. Solins delineated culture into two meanings, one representing culture as it was actually practiced in the behaviors and ideas of daily life. The other explained as formal representations of culture, as a kind of identity to which we claim people belong, as this culture or that culture, constructed of chosen elements, used ideologically to justify our place in the world or that of others, to garner cooperation, as in patriotism for the American way. I've chosen to delineate another broad and commonly used concept in academic and popular use, objectivity. Many have explored and criticized the idea of objectivity, and I will distinguish it in a simple Solons-like dichotomy as the proper beginning of the discussion of activist scholarship. Objectivity 1 is the most definitive characteristic of material evidence. It is to use the object, collected, observed, measured, and tested against an hypothesis or theory, but it is not the theory or analysis derived of it. It is the observation of a thing as evidence for truth, which distinguishes objectivity number 1. Allowing for perceptual differences, such objectivity exists as a fundamental practice of science. One can verify it scientifically when one observes the practice of measurement. Objectivity number 2, however, is also an idea by which scientific method is often described, but it is not actually verifiable by scientific method. It is what is meant by the term objective when used to describe the analysis of an observation as neutrality. The assertion of a researcher's or method's neutrality requires them to have no particular subjective vantage, but to observe from every or no subjectivity. It relies on the belief that an observer's results relate by some degree to a universal truth, which may exist for all time and everywhere. Neither of these qualities of objectivity 2, the neutral observer nor the universal truth, are observable and therefore defy objectivity number 1. Such a purported objectivity 2, objectivity as neutrality, though touted as a definitive quality of scientific knowledge, actually has no scientific basis at all. Neutral or universal truth is definitively ideological, an assumption reinforced by belief. One cannot ascertain by current conceivable scientific methods whether a fact will or will not remain as such in all time and space. We don't even know how large all is, but we have theories about that, varied and changing. Science is a cultural practice inherited from multiple yet delineable cultural traditions, which are taught to practitioners, whether from the societal vantage of his youth or hers, or the institutions in which he or she is trained, or the reward systems of consumers which channel, affirm, or discard their products. Perhaps a neutral scientist should be a feral man or woman, but alas, we prefer them to be loaded with particular brands of culture and their untested assumptions, or the common sense assumptions some believe are tested until they fail the test of time. What we observe in the history of science by virtue of objectivity 1, evidence, is the repeated failure of the assumption of objectivity 2, neutrality. The evidence only demonstrates temporality and subjectivity of scientific truths, although objectivity 1 is important. That might be enough. As Steve Gould or Bernal argued, what we have available to us is comparative plausibility. I think it is now obvious where the idea of human neutrality comes from and how it has come to be employed. Let us begin here before discussing activist scholarship, which is the alternative to arrogating to one's elected self or one's magic method a superior human neutral vantage. These found God in nature, both having been the new white man's ideological cover for the inhumane thefts of colonialism and slavery. Indeed, Aristotle had used nature for this purpose in the 4th century BCE, defying his own logic to provide Alexander with the answer he wanted, that slavery is natural. It was the externalization of cause beyond moral decision-making that externalization is accomplished by the projection of a natural truth and a universal one. And as you will see, there is a confounding also of whiteness with the authority of such universality. This is Linnaeus's tomb in Uppsala. I had the privilege of giving the Sunlinquist lecture there a couple of years ago. May his essentializing racial ideas rest in peace. And who would become the authorities on the interpretation of the ways of nature? Our modern science was born during the late bloom of European colonialism, slavery, and industrial capitalism. Their sons and eventually also their daughters would become the masters of natural science, even as we have seen the definition of whiteness itself retain for them a unique definition of human universality and objectivity in the second sense. Blumenbach first labeled Europeans Caucasians as the standard, even beautiful people. Today, there is massive liberal white denial of their social race itself, which serves to deny their institutional participation in racism, while allowing discrimination and white privilege to continue, little checked. Here, unmarked, unhyphenated Caucasians, or individual Americans, experience themselves as normative, universal, objective humanity against an ethnic, hyphenated, subjective, and marginalized other. At least until the cell phone cameras of 2020, like the TV screens of the 1960s, raised again the veil of the deep subjectivity of white people. From God's chosen to nature's chosen. At the moment of the incomplete breach between theological and scientific systems for the justification of slavery and other inequities, Frederick Douglass began the nature-nurture debate in America. He said to Samuel Morton and Louis Agassiz, it is the circumstances that create the person, biologically and in other ways, not the other way around. Douglass, like Equiano, led the anthropology that ended slavery, while most white American anthropology defended it. 30 years later, only the Haitian diplomat and anthropologist Antonin Firmin would agree not only that the science of human polygenesis was subjective and bogus, the idea that we are, as different races, different species, but he called upon the French Academy, united in their agreement with it, to become positivists, that is, to rely instead on objectivity one, but to no avail. His 660-page tome on the equality of races was technically at least as advanced as Boasian anthropology, which emerged a generation or two later. And I refer you to Flora Loban's year 2000 translation from the French. History was his equivalent of Boasian culture. Furthermore, his point, quote, man makes his own history, end quote, complements Douglass's admonition that scientists make their own moral choices to do the right thing or to lack virtue, to tell the truth or veil the facts, take a side or acknowledge that they either are for us or against us. The African diasporic tradition of activist scholarship, which followed these critiques of science and society, motivates the works of Du Bois, Carter G. Woodson, Cobb, and many others in the current era, like Manning Marable and Leith Mullings here in New York. With regard to Du Bois, and I'm now looking at biocultural studies because that is part of what the African Burial Ground Project entailed, studies of the relationship between biology and culture in which, in opposition to the social Darwinists and eugenicists, it is the circumstances that are reflected in their biological effects not the other way around. So Du Bois defied the white epidemiologists in 1906 who claimed migrating Blacks were becoming ill in the North because they were maladapted to the cold. He showed they were ill everywhere. Uh, uh, they were living under oppressive conditions and with very substantial data. Montague Cobb at Howard University viewed the inequitable social structure of racial segregation like the society's anatomy, showing it to contribute to both inequitable etiologies of disease and healthcare, which in a segregated society created the kinds of health inequities we are seeing now expressed with COVID. He would see his application in the signing of LBJ's Medicaid and Medicare, where he received a pin. He held an Imhotep conference that LBJ attended. He was a president of the NAACP and the American Association of Physical Anthropology. Like Du Bois, he was an activist anthropologist on a winning side, as was Douglass. The WASP mainstream academy laughed its way through Jim Crow to Nazi eugenics until they could no longer do so. As the naturalized cloak of Nordic American and Aryan greed turned even to racialized, marginalized white neighbors, a Holocaust was brought about and the white world began finally to turn against the racial brand of biological determinism by the end of the Second World War. Negritude poet Aimé Césaire described this as applying to whites that which the African diaspora and the colonized Third World had experienced for more than a century. The Chicago School of Sociology and Anthropology that informed Gunnar Myrdal's American Dilemma, that was important in the struggle towards policies of civil rights, did involve Black scholars like St. Clair Drake and E. Franklin Frazier, Allison Davis, along with the Gardners, who joined him in the study of the Deep South. These attended to the structure and culture of American racism the Boasians ignored. And Boasians made no room for African Americans theory. There were a few students like Zora, but Zora, if you follow her life, resisted many things, including, as she said, she saw no reason, no way to apply knowledge of the Pawnee to Alabama. She was interested in, and if you read her most recent posthumous book on Africatown, the power of critique is in the very real words of the people, as John Gwaltney, a student of Mead, in the authentic words of the people, they allowed that truth to emerge. In anthropology, we've been going through increasing phases of building layers and layers of theory on the ethnography, so that I am afraid we too much, or my colleagues too much, turn the people's voices into their theory. But these African diasporans are helping them express their point of view. And there is theory in that as well, that the Boasians were not interested in. African-American anthropologist William Willis finds fault with Boasian anthropology, which he knew as well as anyone, as he had studied at Columbia. In American anthropology's most reflective moment around 1970, he asks anthropologists to undergo deep critical thinking about their history, as did others in Delheim's book, though these papers rarely reference African diasporic intellectuals who had long defined activist scholarship. Anthropologists, as white people, thought they already knew the important questions, and the non-white world, including Black anthropologists, responded unenthusiastically to its results. None of the more than 100 historically Black colleges and universities, many with more advanced and developed curricula than many white schools, has chosen to have a department of anthropology even to this day. I suppose they just don't understand. I believe anthropology, as an intellectually gated white community, does not understand and will not until they are compelled to listen to and follow those who do not look like themselves. To speak for others is not to follow and not to listen to their guidance. Thus, working on behalf of the others' stated purposes, first step is taken on behalf of activist scholarship and opens the door to plural democratization of knowledge. Interestingly, it is only the diligent scholarship of anthropologists of color which raises these issues of liberal white anthropology subjectivity. Francis Hsu's discussion of paradigm breaking is one 1970s version. He had to struggle to get his article as president of the AAA, article on the cultural problem of the cultural anthropologists through the reviewers who'd said things, and I talked to him about it, said things like, well, you've been treated all right as a Chinese American. Why are you complaining? But he was dedicated to discussing the cultural problem of cultural anthropologists and rugged American individualism as well. The mainstream of white anthropologists have consistently defaulted to denial by persistently ignoring us. The African Burial Ground Project, I will turn to in a few moments, is a case in point, though tonight may be one of its exceptions. Willis on the left and Boas on the right. This is the 25th anniversary of the African Burial Ground at the Schomburg Center. Scholars involved in the African diasporic intellectual tradition, not always agreeing with one another by any means, some following activist scholarship to one degree or another. Historian Sylviane Diouf on the left, archaeologist Warren Perry, our dear Leith Mullings, Fatima Jackson, geneticist, and Alondra Nelson, a sociologist, who's, I'll refer to some of her work in just a bit. So let me talk about what is and is not activist scholarship, and thirdly, its pale neoliberal shadow. First, there's Kennewick Man, a discovery made at the same time as the African Burial Ground. He might be called the Ancient One, as the indigenous Umatilla of Washington State choose. A 9,000-year-old skeleton eroded from a riverbank in Washington, Kennewick seemed an important discovery because of its state and morphology. He had a longer head than most more recent Native Americans. He might easily have been considered by scientists as well as the Ancient One. Without evidence of a birth far distant from where he died, the Ancient One becomes a candidate for an example of the early evolution of his Native American descendants. That is, we should expect that they have changed over 9,000 years. Instead, there was Kennewick Man, interpreted racially rather than in terms of evolution. His cranial morphology removed him from both time and space. First, partly by mistake, because Chatters, the forensic specialist who first touched him, did not know his name and did not know his time. Kennewick was thought to be Caucasoid, if not Caucasian, because his head shape was closer to the European average than the American average, by which race is defined. Once his early period was known, these forensic anthropologists became stuck on the idea that now that Caucasoids might have been a separate early founding population of the Americas. He was thought to have an intelligent look by Chatters. The projectile point in his innominate was interpreted as evidence of his outsider status rather than as his time. And in the New York Times and the halls of the National Museum of Natural History, Kennewick had captured the white imagination, the white American imagination. Doug Owsley expressed his sense of obligation to tell his story. What is more pertinent to why modern evolutionary science was overlooked for an older racial science is that we were only 3 years or so into the post-NAGPRA era when specimens like Kennewick were being repatriated to culturally affiliated Native groups for reburial. The Umatilla said it was reasonable to them that someone buried in their land was their ancestor. But the anthropologist had played the race card, the oldest and perhaps the only use of race for unjustified privilege. While the case went back and forth in the courts for 20 years, Chatters, Owsley, Steele, and other neutral anthropologists would mine it for data because they captured the imagination of the white and scientistic courts. This all served their careers. They got a big book out of it in the end and traumatized the humane sensibility of Native people in the Northwest coast. As many of you may know, a Danish laboratory concluded the Ancient Ones' remains were genetically most closely affiliated with Native Americans. Of course they were, and DNA was not necessary to prove it. Native groups had always been correct by virtue of reason as well as faith. The faith and unreasonableness of our colleagues was simply expropriative. Under the guise of neutral science, though never neutral and barely science, always white. Not activist, as I define it, as an effort to create change toward human equity. They've done no more than Hrdliska before them and Morton before him, disregarding the human rights of people of color in order to profit from their careers and to tell a pleasant story of white people at the expense of the objectification of the other. So my example of what is activist scholarship is the African Burial Ground in New York, where in 1991, construction workers in Lower Manhattan unearthed this cemetery, final resting place of some 15,000 enslaved African captives brought to New York in the 17th and 18th centuries to build the city and provide the labor for its thriving economy. The discovery sparked controversy as the African American public held protests and prayer vigils over the following 3 years in order to stop the federal building project that nearly destroyed the site. As a result of protests, a U.S. congressional hearing was held, led by Illinois Congressman Gus Savage, and which would result in agreements between New York Mayor David Dinkins and then State Senator David Patterson and Senator Alphonse D'Amato, that the U.S. General Services Administration would cease construction on part of the site while the public determined what would be done with it. Here you see the original principal investigator with Michael Parrington on the left, with the mayor and the senator, Peggy King Jorde, and Howard Dotson, who headed the Schomburg Center to the right. We'll be hearing more from Peggy shortly. Congressman Gerald Nadler and Charles Rangel also kept watch for at least a decade while colleagues and academic institutions on either side, for us and against us, sought either to defend or undermine Howard University's project. This is I ran into this photo as I was preparing, hadn't seen this for some time, which is the moment I stepped on site to take leadership. And it was a photo made by Warren Barber, who had been the first African-American PhD in archaeology. And it was very important that Warren joined me and stood beside me. He had a contract firm in Buffalo, knew something about, more about contract work than I did, and was very helpful. Sometimes Warren is a Republican, so I had some African-American colleagues who questioned that. It's not an unreasonable question, but he understood what was at stake here. And you may see a couple of African-Americans in this group. The original project, the excavation, went on for a little over a year of actual intensive excavation. And they had to staff up. So they had eventually 40 people, half of whom were just recently trained, all of whom were white. And as the pressure was on, as they were exposed in many ways, they decided to hire a couple of construction workers, the two Black people who you see here, one an Afro-Latino, as though that was to be the solution. I brought in a team of 30 PhDs and laboratories. We were there to create the theory, create the research design, to direct the project, to do the science and the humanistic scholarship we knew. As the new principal investigator and project director based at the Cobb Laboratory at Howard in Washington, I had a unique opportunity to devise an extensive research plan and a clientage model for public engagement with the descendant African-American community. This is the model. The model derived from a combination of African diasporic intellectual traditions of interdisciplinarity and scholar activism, and my recent work with indigenous people through the World Archaeological Congress, attempting to bridge science and repatriation. The African burial ground would acknowledge the ethical rights of its client descendant community. So we have three clients essentially. On the left, the ethical client, this is the descendant community, the people who are most affected by how the burial ground is treated, and arguably for how their history is treated. And so according to AAA ethics, I had worked actually on the version that was completed around 1987 of our professional ethics. We are responsible to protect their well-being, psychological and social well-being. And the way to do that, typically, I've been on in our IRB, is that they would have informed consent. So essentially, we are saying that we don't work with the community, we work for that community. They have the right to decide whether we will do research, conduct research or not. And what we did was ask them for their research questions over a long period of vetting, hearings in downtown and in Harlem, to see what kinds of research questions they would be interested in, sufficiently interested in having us study, that they'd allow us to do that and to keep the bones out of the ground for some period of time before reburial. I can tell you that Leslie Rankenhill and I, working with John Milner Associates, who we also worked with in New York, conducted the first major Smithsonian reburial with the First African Baptist Church, remains in 1986. So we were at the forefront of reburial. And so this is another step that the science can provide useful information if it is done ethically. And it can only be done ethically if that community has authority. The business client, the GSA, we have contracts with them. We have an obligation to them as well, but it should not uh, supersede our ethical requirements. And then we operate as scholars. So, objectivity, number one, evidence is the basis of the knowledge we produce. The profession defines our obligations as well. And so, having worked out a project and 160 some page research design, very extensive research design, we were allowed to take the remains to Howard. This is the Ties That Bind ceremony in 1994 that celebrated the beginning of a project that welcomed our common ancestors. And it was a 2-day scientific and cultural celebration at the university. And we began our research. So the formal federal steering committee that Peggy King Jorde was executive director of, Howard Dotson chaired, that we met with to ascertain our questions, met also in open public hearings for a couple of years. And we decided that the public agreed that the questions should be the origins of the people buried in the African burial ground. They were interested in their physical quality of life under enslavement, biological and cultural transformations from African societies to something we now call African American, and for the modes of resistance of enslaved Africans at the origins of the United States. And this is I've found over time in other projects and and examinations of things like Colonial Williamsburg, that resistance is often not shown, because once the resistance of Africans is shown, then one begins to ask the question, what are they resisting? And then the brutality of European and Euro-American slavery comes through. It may, and yet if for the valorization of white founding fathers, one does not show resistance, then the humanity of Africans who were not chattel, who were not domesticated animals, who resisted in every way all of the time, that would be sacrificed. So the two things are often, in opposition to one another, and perhaps even the disappearing of the African and African American presence in early New York is the same kind of technique, where slavery appears not to have existed in a place where it was essential for the wealth of whites in all of the 13 colonies. The project's interdisciplinary research involved skeletal, biological, genetic, archaeological, and historical studies that were framed within a broad African diasporic context, essential for understanding the lifetime experiences of the people who were enslaved and buried in New York. And that kind of interdisciplinarity, it's customary, although the biology is not often there. All the rest is in Africana studies programs. These are interdisciplinary programs. Du Bois is interdisciplinary. Cobb, for men, they're interdisciplinary. They need context even for the biology that they're looking at, which makes perfect sense. And yet our forensic and archaeological predecessors who were involved in the excavation knew and cared little about that context, laying scientific claim to the objectivity of their race estimation methodology. And so there was a reburial in 2007 after we completed our work. As retaining the sacred nature of the site, a national monument, and a visitor center, an 8,000-foot visitor center rather than a 2,000 square foot interpretive center, and a plaque on the wall of the building upon which the GSA had previously insisted. On its opening, the review of a white historian for the New York Times asserted that the activist efforts were never needed, really, to reach that goal, which is historically untrue, a deflection to the city's white virtue. And we have the pleasure as researchers of joining in the public events to celebrate these who we all began to think of as our ancestors, having spent years cleaning each bone and engaged in a variety of studies. The African Burial Ground Project is not, and you can find it on the, go to the National Park Service National Monument website and it will be there. But it is also, because of its clientage model, certainly the first large ethical project in bioarchaeology, because we asked the people who should have stewardship whether we could have permission. And also, despite a long, droning 1990s version of concern for reverse racism, that Black people were heading this project, unapologetically empathetic Black people as scientists who had trained all of their lives and had all the credentials that the folks who were in the field did not have, that this was somehow reverse racism. And yet, as tends to be the habit of African Americans, we were inclusive. I think these are our chief researchers. I think we had the most racially diverse and equitable project thus far that I have seen in anthropology, and I've been around it for a pretty long time. And interdisciplinary in that beyond our project, there were other interpretive and artistic projects, including on the left, Lorenzo Pace, the sculptor who designed the large Chihuahua sculpture monument in Foley Square. Leon, who designed the National Monument. Mother Blakey, and he's an architect. Mother Blakey, an activist, member of Queen Mother Moore's Church. There are so many ways in which we were integrated with so many different angles on our ancestry. And in the end, in 2009, we produced a major report. I told you where you can find it, though it is sometimes difficult to find. That there was a point at which, and there's an interesting resistance that continues, and I won't go into too much detail, but the National Park Service had removed our volumes offline that had been from the beginning, from 2004, actually, the initial reports had been posted at the National Park Service site with a spurious justification that some law they thought prevented them from making our volumes available. I think there's a lot of mischief around. And all I can say is we called them on it. They acknowledged that they were were misled, and so or misinformed, and so it's back up now. We have to keep an eye on this, on everything. So our longstanding data shows high infant mortality, that they struggled in 18th century New York. 40% of the dead were children. Women also have fairly high mortality. And when comparing them with whites from Trinity Church, the English population that would have presumed to have owned them, you see that the highest mortality in every place except the late 20s, ages 25 through 29, higher mortality among Africans. I have to apologize for this chart. It's the only one I could get my hand on. The 40 to 44 figure is inverted, so the burial ground it is actually, it should be positioned where Trinity Church is. And then 7 to 9 times as many, depending on whether they're men or women, Europeans will live past the age of 55 as Africans will, as a measure of the arduousness of their lives. We also, because we had the origin question, developed 2 new methods. One is chemical sourcing to identify where an individual was born. Joseph Jones and Alan Goodman developed this method after we had, through Pam Bumstead, the idea that it could be done among our team. And so we took individuals with filed teeth, which means they were probably born and raised in some part of West or West Central Africa. And the little wormhole-like lines you see at the bottom of this photograph of a sectioned dental crown is the laser ablation sample that was taken to assess the chemistry of the tooth derived from these pathways, from the soil, the water, the food, that demonstrates the relationship of the individual with his or her ecosystem. And then we found in our first findings that those with filed teeth, and those are the dark bars, the black bars, had very low levels of lead compared to children, those who died as children and who were more likely to have been born and raised in New York. So it's exposure to Western technology. I mean, these people are coming from highly developed societies with international trade in Central Africa and West Africa. They're using iron, of course, but they don't use lead much. And pewter and the solder in pipes that Europeans are using introduces lead into the diet in a way that provides a signature for where individuals were born and raised. And so the 3 individuals with the light bars on the left half of the graph were probably born and raised in Africa on the basis of their lead alone. We don't need the dental modification. Genetics is certainly a lot less precise and less contextually rich as a way of assessing an individual's origins than a number of other methodologies, like any sort of good historiography gives us more. But it serves as one line of evidence, sometimes erroneously, and sometimes helping the conversation among the different disciplinary data sets towards the most plausible conclusions. And these are our initial, on the right, mitochondrial DNA assessments of origins. and this top center craniometrics, which is not telling us anything too different than what we knew, that they are West and West Central Africans, and dental traits on the bottom are, and though we never we did not do as much DNA research as we had hoped, and that as we were promised actually by the GSA, and we fought over that for a couple of years. One of our members did go off, and one of our junior, or not, an assistant level geneticist did go off and found the first direct-to-consumer ancestry service. And since then, there has been the growth of 23andMe, Ancestry.com, and others. We find that African Americans are not the only people interested in their ancestry, or perhaps in DNA. Fertility and infant mortality were high, and there was no natural population increase. However, in these respects, this northern colonial city was very similar to South Carolina and the Caribbean, to which its economy was tied. Regions where conditions for African captives were amongst the hardest. The community's growth occurred only as a result of continuous forced migration from Africa, since not enough children survived to allow the population to grow on its own. This evidence of harsh conditions is consistent with the idea that slaveholders treated African people as though they were disposable during the period of 1807, or prior to 1807, 1808, when the transatlantic trade was ended. Now, one discovery, our most recent, required an interdisciplinary and diasporic framework to tell, and brings together the elements of all four research questions. Census data show a significantly greater number of women than men in the years which followed the two most violent rebellions, 1712 and 1741, of New York's enslaved Africans. We could also show, based on historical documentation, a new preference for the importation of women and children at those times, associated with European slaveholders' attempts to stem rebellion associated with excess numbers of men, also with urban occupational changes and efforts to reduce costs. So this is the political economy of what you're seeing, which is the changing sex ratio over the 18th century. The skeletal biological result, well, we recently examined a muscle attachment called the linea aspera, which is this long attachment on the back of the femur or thigh bone, which grows larger under persistent strain of walking, lifting, and other labor-related behavior. At the beginning of the 18th century, African women had a lower frequency of enlarged linea aspera than did men. And you can see here, this chart spans the period from just the turn of the 17th century, end of the 1600s, to the late period, which is about the time just after the American Revolution, the War of Independence. So what you're seeing are changes in the frequency of individuals who have enlarged linea aspera, and we made comparisons so that we know there are some that have smaller ones, but these are the enlarged muscle attachments that involve the most arduous labor. The frequency of those, relative frequency of those with enlarged linea aspera, when compared to those with virtually, with very slight linea. So they were the folks who worked least hard. So what we are seeing is that more and more women are working very hard over time, more and more men are, and that the women are closing on men in terms of their work. In fact, enthesopathy, which also involves some tearing of muscle, the frequency of this muscle attachment, the expansion of the muscle attachment, as well as some calcified connective tissue, that women, this may represent greater strain on the muscle in women who are working at least as hard physically as are men. So some might argue that the increasing importation of women had to do with a more benign slavery, of less arduous labor due to the urbanization and increased domestic work. But a muscle attachment is a muscle attachment, and this is clear evidence of strain for women as well as for men. As a final note on our findings, I want to look a little bit at the Sankofa symbol, or the heart shape on burial 101, an individual who's a bit enigmatic. His chemistry has changed. First, we thought he was African born. Now we think Joseph Jones thinks he was probably American born, but who has filed teeth, slightly but definitely. So he has carried that African idea into the Americas. He has some evidence of having, some evidence of a tropical skin disease, yaws, that so where he's been is not so clear, but he has, dying at about the age of 35, has a heart shape made of tacks on his coffin lid. And that heart shape, if it's one of the three that Warren Perry and Gene Housen, archaeologists, have been considering. It may be the Ghanaian or Akana Dinkra symbol Sankofa, which everyone loved, scientists, the researchers and the public, because it means look to the past as a guide to the present and the future. Go back and fetch it. What more profound symbol to have at this site. We were open, of course. Can't absolutely know what somebody thought in the mid-18th or late 18th century when they buried someone. But there are a number of plausible possibilities. This is one, and one that, I think the descendant community has a right to choose the symbols of its ancestors it wishes to embrace. We as scientists, are more conservative in our report. But we would not go to the point of a researcher, a historian named Eric Seaman, who published an article that was released and announced in the New York Times on the eve of the opening of the visitor center. And its claim was that this could not be Sankofa, that Sankofa was not among any of the Adinkra collected and present in collections of Europeans, where there were 3 Adinkra cloths. And therefore and what I really think he was suggesting, if you read the article as a whole, is that we as African Americans, or maybe we as Black researchers, are biased, that we're trying to create something that doesn't really exist, the idea that we have African roots. He says we need to understand that we are Creole. Now, what my understanding of Creolization does not mean that's in antagonism with the idea of having African roots, but that is how he expresses it. And in the end, he says, he's looked at the Dutch Adinkra, 1825 or before, and of the 13 stampings, none is Sankofa. So a couple of years ago, graduate student and I took a look. I asked her to file through these Adinkra, and we reviewed it. And there it was, on that very same Dutch Adinkra. And Kweku Oforianza, the African art historian, has confirmed it. This is Sankofa. Not that one would have to have confirmation of that kind to do the archaeology, but I give this as one of many expressions we've had with New York historians, especially, who I don't know whether the resistance is to the fact that we're archaeologists and not historians, or Black and not white, or from Washington or not New York, but who are very resistant to any sort of collegial support. There are a few exceptions. David Blight, Ira Berlin, and I had a good relationship in general. But there is, it seems to me, this is an extraordinary case of, was he not telling the truth? Did he miss it because he was so certain, so biased, that we weren't telling the truth? At any rate, it's a story that needs to be told. We were able to meet with two royal houses from Ghana way back in the 90s at Howard, who came under the Adinkra symbol Fahankra to reunite the house. And we were in a position then to share our heart shape and talk about Sankofa. This is the Cemiterio dos Pretos Novos in Rio de Janeiro. Autumn Rain, who did a dissertation with me, did an excellent job of describing the significance of that African cemetery and its comparison with descendant community efforts in Rio de Janeiro and New York. Our ideas are being taken to many places. And this, the new rubric of the National Trust for Historic Preservation gives accedes to the rights of descendant communities to be empowered to have really a go, no-go power equal to any others on the boards of presidential plantations or museums, to tell their own story, that they have structural parity. So this goes beyond cemeteries. At Montpelier, the Montpelier Descendants Committee operates according to this rubric that was developed there. In creating new exhibitions, they have to struggle nonetheless against an old board of the foundation that's not used to Black people insisting that they have an equal say in the telling of the history of a place whose majority population and whose builders were their ancestors. But they are achieving their goals, and they would use our clientage model for the treatment of their cemetery. In other words, there they have stewardship. Elsewhere, they have parity in influence. Well, that's my story. This is the final opening of the National Monument. Much has been learned by virtue of being receptive, of listening, of following the people most affected, and in our case, from a tradition that has long done that, recognizing that we are obligated to be part of the uplift of a community whose oppression is often at the hands of those who claim they're objective, they have no particular bias in the construction of the past. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Michael. That was an amazing kind of walkthrough and really an intellectual kind of journey to kind of think through the history of such ways of thinking, right? The production of ignorance in some sense that goes alongside the sort of generative production of knowledge. So we can imagine that everyone is clapping and is wholly enthusiastic about this. We're now going to be joined by two brilliant interlocutors, Peggy King Jorde and Rachel Watkins, and I'm going to introduce them. So Rachel and Peggy, if you'd like to turn on your cameras, you're welcome to do so. Peggy King Jorde is a cultural projects consultant, design professional, activist, and a Harvard Loeb Fellow, recognized for her extraordinary efforts to preserve New York City's African burial ground. As director of memorialization, King Jorde spearheaded efforts for the National Monument and Historic District, the Interpretive Center, and the reburial of more than 400 African ancestors. And we saw some of those photographs earlier in Michael's work. Harvard Magazine's article, Life by Design, chronicles Peggy's journey from her native Albany, Georgia, to her academic pursuits at Harvard School of Design. King Jorde brings a wide range of experience in civic development, from providing project oversight for New York's most iconic museums and cultural institutions, to chairing Blue Ribbon committees, including the Malcolm X Memorial with the late Dr. Betty Shabazz, to being a key influencer in art panels tasked with commissioning art for public spaces. Formerly a special advisor to New York City Mayor David Dinkins, King Jorde currently lends considerable focus to campaigns that protect disenfranchised histories. She's working with global stakeholders to preserve an African burial ground on St. Helena, UK in the South Atlantic. She's an impact producer and film participant for a London-based documentary about preserving the liberated African burial ground and depot. Welcome, Peggy King Jorde.
Thank you.
Would you like to go ahead and make your comments? Or actually, why don't I also introduce Rachel, since we're all here?
Okay.
Rachel Watkins is a biocultural anthropologist with an emphasis on African-American biohistory and social history, bioanthropological research practices and histories of the US American biological anthropology. Initially trained in skeletal biology, her work focused on looking at relationships between health, disease, and social isolation in people whose remains are in the West Montague Cobb Anatomical Collection and interred at the New York African Burial Ground. Studies were carried out in the scholar activist tradition of deconstructing racialized interpretations of human biology and the centering of Black bodies in constructing racial categories and hierarchies. This research led to a broader interest in how African-American skeletal remains and living populations were centered in the development of research practices and racial formation in US biological anthropology. Current projects continue to draw on intellectual and political work tied to Cobb and his laboratory from 1932 to the present at sites for understanding science as a social practice. This includes traditions of Black scholar activism contesting scientific racism, our field's efforts towards critiquing scientific racism without attending to structural racism, and the positionality of scientific researchers. Please join me in welcoming both of these amazing scholar activists and women. I'm going to leave it to both of you to see how this, how you want to kind of take the evening. There, Michael gave us so much to kind of work with, and so we'll listen to your comments, and then we'll open it up to the audience.
Okay.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
So I guess for me, I just have to say, Michael, this is so deeply meaningful. Overall, all of the work that's happened. What I can offer, and why it's so meaningful to me, for obvious, other than the obvious reasons, is that putting your work into context. When you mentioned the article tied to the New York Times reporter who said that, you know, you didn't need, the activism wasn't really necessary. I can attest to the fact that activism, in fact, was necessary. As someone who worked within city government, who dealt with federal government long before having the professionals like yourself on this project, and the level of activism that actually had to go on within the mayor's office. And so I'll just share two quick stories. For me, working in the mayor's office of construction and having access to the environmental impact statement, which told the government, which the government paid professionals initially to tell them what the site what might unfold at the site, and that any small amount of information that they could glean from an archaeological dig would be important, because we know so little about the history of African people in the city of New York. And so as this fell into my hands and I began to sort of research it, working in the mayor's office, and this is before they even broke ground. Later, as time goes by, and I am invited to take a tour out towards the site. Older buildings have been cleared. They're doing some sort of testing. And I was with a group, and I was the only African-American with this particular group. And I did have intelligence that said that the federal government had a gag order for the anthropologist on site not to really talk about what potentially this site was about. And having some of the people in my group pose questions to one of the anthropologists who happened to come to the fence, who was going to sort of provide or field some questions. And one of the questions put to this gentleman was that these people had heard that the site was a Negroes bearing background, and what could this anthropologist tell us about it? Like, what could he do or say to confirm it? Now, this is on the heels of my father having passed away. I'm from Southwest Georgia. I grew up during the civil rights movement. I grew up in a segregated South, in an American apartheid. And to know the work of people just simply from the civil rights movement, and in that one moment, the response of this anthropologist or archaeologist to this person, this person who was just asking, was very eager to know, was a response that basically just sort of dismissed, erased, downplayed any significance of the lives of the people who were there. And that, for me, it created an outrage. That in that one moment, on the order of the federal government, that the history of, to think that the history of even my family, the work that people I knew during the civil rights movement, that would all be erased because of a gag order by the United States government, and because of individuals in this position, this very powerful position, to be able to kind of deny and really completely downplay. The second story. So I think your talk makes me think about the importance of the activism that took place in order to take control of some of how it is that you engage the community, the kind of information that you make available. And then the second story is later on, sitting in a meeting with the United States General Services Administration, and sitting in the meeting, and this is very early on, before your team has gotten on, and there was an original contract in place, and there was a report regarding what was happening on the site, and it was just sort of one of these weekly project meetings. And there had been some buzz about some things that had been said publicly that were considered erroneous historically. And so in that meeting, I found that it was my responsibility to raise the question, look, who do you have on your team? And this is to the archaeology group in the room. Who do you have on your team that is a Black historian or a Black professional in the same field? Because as the old story goes, or the old line, tales of the hunt will always glorify the hunter, until the lions have their own historian. And the response to me was, well, in our profession, we interpret the site, we'll write it up, and we'll make it available, and there will be colleagues, if they differed from us, they can come back and rewrite and do a whole other study. And my response to that was, the problem is, and the challenge is, that you are being hired by the United States government, by our tax dollars, by everybody, the Black community, the larger, broader community. You're being hired to interpret this story, which has always been the case. It's been interpreted, it was getting interpreted the same way, but interpret this story and then put it in a take one folder for which the government would pay, and put it in a public space. And that would be the word. And it was during that time, then my response was, that can't happen. Now is the time for us to revisit this and have other voices at the table. And then the question was put to me, well, who do we know anybody? And because I was working in the mayor's office at the time, I said, if you don't know anyone, I'll help try and find someone. And so it was through that, also that work, my activism within the government, to then start getting on the horn and finding out who are the Michael Blakeys out there? Who are all these other people who are out there who could weigh in and be a part of this project? So activism, I'm elated that the activism that I felt that I engaged in helped to move that needle and to do the amazing work that I've listened to, and not only just the science, but also the activism in the science as well.
Thank you so much for that, Peggy. Uzma, I'm assuming it's okay for me to just dive in. When we talked previously, after hearing what Michael was going to share and what Peggy was going to share, I decided that it would be really important for me to talk about the fact that I was 19 when this happened 30 years ago. And, you know, for me, celebrating this time has involved thinking back to meeting Michael when I was 18 and deciding, after changing my major every week, that I wanted to major in anthropology, and coming to him and letting him know of my interests and him telling me about the Cobb collection. And me saying, I'm kind of resistant because, of course, like everybody else, I wanted to be like Zora Neale Hurston, and him patiently explaining to me this tradition of African descendant scholar activism and understanding health in the context of social location. So I think for so many of us, the Cobb Laboratory and the New York African Burial Ground Project set us on a path, and mine was that. One of the other things that I shared when we were preparing for this was my recollection and the impact to this day that it's had on me to be a part of a project where you were trained in skeletal biology and you were also trained in public engagement. You know, we had to know who was a part of the descendant community. We had to meet them. We went to New York. This is how I met, Peggy. We went to the Office of Public Education and Interpretation. So the expectation was that we were not just to be in the laboratory handling the bones, but we were also supposed to understand the broader context of the project and understanding what it means to be a scholar activist bioanthropologist. Similarly, the laboratory was not just populated with researchers, with skeletal biologists and osteologists and geneticists. Members of the descendant community who were nearby would come by and check on us. I recall that, and that having a big impact on me as someone who was so young. Similarly, when classes from different schools would come to the laboratory for tours, initially the lab director, the late Mark Mack, would do most of them, but we were ultimately, all of us trained, the osteological technicians, the osteological technician assistants, we were all trained to conduct those tours, and it was expected that that was a part of what we would do. So the laboratory space was a space of intense, very sophisticated interdisciplinary training. It was also a space of reckoning and reconciliation in terms of the significance of the project being a project of this magnitude, being at a historically Black college, being helmed with a scientific director who is African-American, and as Michael said, one of the most diverse research teams that we've seen on a project to date. One of the other things I wanted to highlight, and I didn't mention this previously, was that part of our training as part of the work also involved exposing us to, in very hands-on ways, as well as in the classroom, to various traditions of understanding human beings as biological organisms. So we actually, Michael had all of us go and participate in the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology Forensic Anthropology workshop, because it was not enough, he understood, to talk to us about a history of racial identification in skeletons and to just describe it. But part of our training and part of our work of the project was to learn about this tradition in a very hands-on way. It was a 5-day, very intensive thing that solidified the fact that I was not going to be doing forensic anthropology because it grossed me out. So I left Howard really confident in what it meant to be a part of this African descendant scholar activist tradition of, biocultural study. And I left inspired to continue doing that in the form of pursuing a master's degree in applied anthropology, where I brought what I learned in my bachelor's into a more intensive study. And that experience, primarily working with Tony Whitehead, also added to my confidence. But my subsequent experience after leaving those spaces were spaces in which I experienced the New York African Burial Ground Project actually being weaponized and being used as a frame for this kind of ongoing contestation and questioning of Black intellect and Black leadership. One of the things that I recall being asked incessantly, and I'm not exaggerating, is, well, okay, so the New York African Burial Ground largely had African descendant scholars, or mostly African Americans. Does that mean that you believe that only Black people can do this work? And that's kind of one of those really, it's such a typical, question, and speaks to so much of what we now understand in the context of fragility, the particular brand of fragility around, of racism. And it was also weaponized to kind of amplify this idea that the work that scholars of color do is only relevant to their lives, right? And it's not work that is broadly applicable to the discipline. And this is actually what led me to want to do more research on intellectual history and the nature of knowledge production. Was this kind of ongoing experience that I had throughout my graduate school tenure with these questions, and with this kind of contestation. So what I will end with is that we're in a moment now where folks are very open to speaking about and operationalizing anti-racist agendas. And there are many, colleagues in bioanthropology who've been doing this long before that. Nonetheless, the New York African Burial Ground has not played a role in developing these anti-racist agendas, even within bioanthropology, to the extent that they should, based on the model that was provided in terms of the ethical epistemology, as well as bringing together such a diverse group of folks. So one of the things that I would lift up to everyone who is listening here as we're reflecting on this 30-year anniversary is that the New York African Burial Ground, and kind of reckoning with the New York African Burial Ground, should actually play a role in our current anti-racist agenda. That part of our anti-racist agenda should involve reckoning with the burial ground and the ways in which the work that was produced and the work that was done and the folks who did the work were marginalized. I think that would be important. And I think that perhaps we're ready to do that. Thank you.
That was amazing. So we're gonna open this up. There's so much here. Oh my gosh, I'm just like, yes, I hear you in so many levels. So we're gonna open it up to Q&A. We already have a question, which I will read out to all three of you. And I think, Rachel, you had already started talking about HBCUs, but I'll contextualize the question. Justin Donovan has asked, or started with gratitude. Thank you all for the work that you've done. The New York African Burial Ground was a monumental project on many levels. Can you talk a bit about the importance of HBCUs, that is Howard, in facilitating the project and the infrastructural groundwork laid by Cobb? And then he sends much love.
Hi, Justin. I'm going to be very quick, and I'm going to say this again as somebody who was 19 when all this got started. I was a part of a conference panel just this past Friday, where in that panel, one of my colleagues said, you know what, here are all these different folks, these Black folks, these BIPOC folks in bioanthropology. And she ran them down and she said, it would have been so incredible to learn about these folks when I was a student. What if I had learned about these folks when I was a student instead of just now, 20 years later? And that's the thing we did. Justin did. Justin is a bison. You were able to learn anthropology in that way. I know I wouldn't have ended up being an anthro major had I not gone to an HBCU.
I'd say that there is, as there always has been, more potential for anthropology at HBCUs than they have recognized. When I was an undergraduate there in Howard in the 70s, it had its first critical mass of Black anthropologists. There were 9 anthropologists total in that department of sociology and anthropology. And this was the generation of notes from the natives. The Association of Black Anthropologists had just begun. These were fabulous people trained at, Michigan, where the new archaeology was developing, the Oxford, Harvard, all activists in their hearts, that they were trying to do what I think in the new journal that's replaced Notes from the Natives of the Association of Black Anthropologists proclaims: transforming anthropology. The opportunity at HBCUs is to transform anthropology. On the other side, anthropology has remained, its canon is that of a gated white intellectual community. So all those efforts that, so in a sense, anthropology does not want us. Anthropology will not listen to us. I will not, I hope you will read my paper in Current Anthropology on archaeology under the blinding light of race. A lot of that is about the fact that some aspects of public engagement is basically taken off from our beginning with a blunted edge and no citation of who they owed for the intellectual, the theoretical leadership. So we are, and very often, the places where Black anthropologists are most appreciated are in Africana studies departments. I've been in all of these. So I'm saying that there is a tension that's real. Black universities use sociology and history to tell the story, our story, better than the average sort of Boasian, cultural reductionist, othering anthropology of the primitivization of the other, not talking about racism, but Blacks could, in those places, develop that which they're developing wherever they go. So would I like to see that open up at Howard, which is the most, it's wonderfully positioned because, as you said, the Cobb Laboratory, one of the reasons we could take on the African Burial Ground is because that we already had a laboratory and a collection that an African American biocultural anthropology that, or bioarchaeology that no other university equaled. I mean, the Congress gave us a sole source contract because between that and the extraordinary African diasporic, curriculum of the graduate program in the history department, the African studies department, and all these kinds of things at Howard, the combination is unparalleled. But anthropology has not been, except through the African Burial Ground, the greatest thing. And I will just say about the African Burial Ground that what we had at Howard were those of the faculty and students who are of the best of Howard, who loved what we were doing and gave us all the support in the world. I do not think we could have pulled this off and held off the federal government's interference and attempt to stop us were this not a Black institution. At the same time, Howard University is a uniquely federal university. It's one of only 2 universities that was established by the federal government. At that time, $300 million of its $600 million budget came from the federal government. And I believe the Swigert administration's knees buckled, but from the government pressing on them to get rid of this. But because of the best of Howard, they did not, we made it to the end. But I think they have backed off of anthropology because what we did is also dangerous in the minds of some who also generally may think we don't need anthropology anyway. The historians, the sociologists. And so it's a devilish environment. I'm a Howard brat. I was born in this hospital. My father taught there. He went to dental school there. I know this place very well. So it's complicated. Its day for anthropology may come. And we have given it, Dr. Cobb gave it resources on which to build.
I was wondering, Peggy, did you want to add anything about HBCUs? No? Okay. There's another question here that I hear quite a bit as someone who does a lot of work with the community-based and participatory work by Joanne Barron. And so they ask, I wonder if you could go into more detail about the process of consulting with the descendant community in developing the research design. Did you encounter major disagreements? And if so, how were they resolved? Conflict resolution is something that often comes up, I find, when we kind of think about community-based, because of course communities are made of people, right? And we don't all agree on anything.
Oh, and this was a volatile situation. Right. We entered, it was already a mess and alarming. I remember, I want to say, Peggy, I remember you were the one who called me. And I remember you saying, now, is it true that one can tell an individual's race by 2 measurements of the hip? And I said, oh, Lord, these people. So it was I cannot describe it adequately. I'll leave my colleagues to make an attempt. But it was a hot potato in every respect. But in terms of the kind of negotiation that we did as researchers, there's one thing that stands out. An example and there were many divisions among African-American community, and Peggy can tell you more about that as head of the steering committee. But one of the things that I remember hearing at overall research design in Harlem And I'm glad now to have an opportunity to say these names. There were senior African-American women who were very important in making everything work and representing the community and keeping their shoulder to the wheel. Aduni Tabasi, Miriam Francis, Eloise Dix, Mother Franklin, all these people Peggy knows. And we were in a group of folks, including them, and they said, we don't want you to discuss slavery. They said there was no slavery in Africa. And so, and this is where I'm sure the African-American sensibility was involved, because I heard them, some others of us heard them. We understood what they were saying. Very often, I had heard enough of it in my life, where whites will say, and if you're in Virginia, Black people will be convinced at times, that slavery was created by Africans, that they were already slaves, and then they were therefore just collected and sent to America to be saved by Christianity or something like that. And but so they were saying that they weren't slaves, there weren't slaves in Africa. And we said, well, we thought about it. We said, look, we understand how this is used. And we understand there are various kinds of servitude in Africa. As Joseph Inekori has written, we will hire Inekori so that we can show the breadth of servitude in Africa. But our understanding is that materially, there was slavery in Africa, and they were trafficking in human captives. And but we will approach that we will not approach that in a way that's apologetic of European involvement. And in fact, Inekori joined us later, and he said, well, let me tell you, if I offer whatever he said, $10,000 for every human head, the next morning I will find human heads on my stoop. And he's talking about, as an economic historian, that it's the demand side that creates the thing. The demand side was the European and American trade. At any rate, some African Americans and some West Africans are very sensitive about the idea that they were involved in slavery. Some asked us sort of like, why would you even open that up? And we said, no, we will, the material evidence is that there was slavery, and you have a right to close the book and to say you will go to the usual practitioner, religious practitioners, to bury your dead. But if we're going to be involved, we base our involvement on the evidence. We also understand the politics of the question with which you are concerned, and we can address it, in these more sophisticated ways. And that could have been a deal breaker, right? But it was not.
Yeah. I wonder, Peggy, if you might be able to share some of your experiences, because you saw it from a different perspective. You were kind of in it.
Yeah. Well, just once the federal steering committee was formed, and we had regular meetings at the Schomburg Center in Harlem, I don't know that everybody really expected the kind of turnout that generally would come on a regular basis. Because when I started, I actually was sort of taking minutes by hand, which then graduated to, we finally had to tape the meetings, because you would have so many members of the community, which to me, I found really wonderful and amazing. Also, true enough, contentious sometimes, but the interest and the multitude of perspectives and commentary was critical to ultimately the outcome. And particularly for the New York community to gather together, and you have people from Brooklyn and the Bronx and Manhattan up in Harlem, really sort of converging and talking about and going through this whole process of, how is it that we're going to tell our stories? How is it that we're going to sort of lay out the framework to this government entity that was really just charged with building a building but how's it that we're going to impact that? And basically, and I think, Rachel, you used the term before, weaponized. Dealing with development, oftentimes development is weaponized against, cultural resource protection and what it is that we can glean. And it's really ironic, because oftentimes when you design a building, when you design something, you hope for something significant at the site to help inform your building and set it apart from everything else, whatever it is that you're doing. So here we were, on a regular basis, meeting with the larger community. I mean, it was tough, but completely critical to the entire process in terms of the interpretive center, everything. And all of that information, I do share a quick story that the information that the community, well, the science of the work that was being done by Michael's team, and also that community information was so also important to the designers who ultimately did the memorial and a lot of the other artwork within the historic district. So it was critical. It was critical.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for that. I just was looking at the time. We have a few more questions. Maybe I'll just try to kind of combine one more and we can do like a quick answer because it is 8:25. What do you understand the efficacy of the increasingly popular, well, I'm going to try to rephrase this question. How does community archaeology fit within the genealogy of activist scholarship? And then I'm going to link this question to another question that comes in that has to do with the demands for reparations that might include resources to discover and preserve our African burial grounds throughout the US, as well as supporting us to find our relatives. So in some sense, if we can talk through the relationship between community archaeology and activist scholarship, and then how does that then link to our demands for reparations? Right, in some sense. That seems like a very large question now that I've asked it. But if maybe we could have like a couple of responses, I think that would be good. Short responses.
Here's the simplest answer, I think, and you could explore my, again, this article that I just published, is that if the community does not have power, if they do not have the right to refuse, then it's not engagement, because you're not working for them. And there are, and I didn't really get to this in my paper, but there are a variety, whether it's civic engagement in Maryland or wherever, with a multitude of stakeholders who swamp the descendant community's voice, or something like, somebody goes and asks a Black woman a question about what she'd like to know in their archaeology, and then they decide what that means. A lot of it is, what's going on now is public archaeology, which is essentially archaeologists go to the public and interest them in what's important about archaeology. That it reigns as faux engagement, which is about what the community wants archaeologists to do, not what archaeologists want the community to do.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Thank you. Then those, I think, are great words to kind of close with. Really thinking about how the community has power, or should be given that power, and the questions of consent and research, I think, are very important. So thank you. I cannot express how grateful I am to all three of you for being here and being with us this evening and presenting all this work and all the work that you've all done already. I think it's been quite remarkable. And to all of you viewing this, thank you all for joining us for this webinar presentation by the Anthropology section of the New York Academy of Sciences. Our next event is on March 29th. Dr. Fatima Jackson will be joining us, and the talk will be followed by a discussant comments by Dr. Robin Nelson. So I hope you'll be able to join us for that important talk and discussion. Once again, thank you so much, Michael, Rachel, and Peggy. It was absolutely amazing. I feel so much gratitude, and I just feel so full with so much of the work that you've all done. So thank you. And to all of you who have attended this from all across the globe, be well and be safe. And thank you for joining us. Have a
Thank
good
you, Uzma.